Hello again, and welcome to another serving of the Digest. Please like, subscribe, and hit the the bell logo to support us and spread the love. Now, today we're really lucky because we've got a guy called Gareth Carrol. He's a lecturer in linguistics at the University of Birmingham, and he's just launched his latest book, which is called Jumping Sharks and Dropping Mics. Sorry about this, the cat's biting me. And while it's pretty informative, it's also a lot of fun. Now, stop it. The book examines how we use and understand figurative language, and this includes idioms, metaphor, and other non-literal forms of expression. So, hi, Gareth, and welcome. It's wonderful having you on board.
Hi, really nice to be here.
Yeah, it's fabulous. And I have to say, well done on David Crystal saying that he wishes he'd written it. That is some endorsement.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure lots of your viewers will know David Crystal. He's one of the biggest popular linguists around. He's written extensively in so many different areas of English language, and I was really thrilled that he agreed to read a copy of the manuscript and gave me such a glowing endorsement. So yeah, I figured I must be doing something right.
I think you are as well. I've had a quick look through the book myself, and I have to say there's some of the expressions in there I wasn't aware of. I mean, the title itself, Jumping Sharks. I wasn't aware of that one. Dropping the mic, obviously, but that's a relatively new one. And you're focusing on the newer rather than the older expressions and idioms, aren't you?
Yeah, so the point of the book was exactly that a few years ago I started sort of paying attention to quite how many idioms had come into the language in the last few decades, from TV, from the movies, and especially from internet culture. And I guess the point is there's lots of idiom dictionaries out there. There's lots of websites with, idioms for learners of English, or just, histories of idioms for people who are interested. But, classic idioms like kick the bucket, there's still pretty much it's a bit of a guess as to where they come from, because they've been in the language for centuries. We've got some ideas. I've heard convincing explanations, but there's no way of really knowing. These kind of more modern idioms, as the ones you've just mentioned, so things like dropping mics, or dropping the mic, which I think is a phrase that a lot of people will now know, that emerged in the 80s, and we can track its progress. Jumping Sharks came around the same time in the 80s, and actually is one that came directly from TV. It's based on the TV show Happy Days, which older viewers might recognise more than younger ones, maybe. But in that, there's a sort of a character called the Fonz, who's an incredibly cool character. And in one episode, they have the Fonz involved in a water skiing competition where he literally water ski jumps over a caged shark. And given how outlandish this was, and sort of how out of keeping with the kind of things Happy Days normally did, it was sort of perceived as, people sort of said retrospectively this was the point at which it kind of went a bit too far and lost all credibility. So jumping the shark has kind of come to mean something that's really just gone beyond the realms of sort of realism. A lot of people used the phrase to describe, for example, Trump being elected. There's lots of nice examples from newspapers of people saying things like, America jumped the shark, democracy jumped the shark, these kind of things. So really, when you sort of think something's gone too far and it's now a bit of a joke, it's said to have jumped the shark. But all of these examples, the point is we have a very clear origin. We can find the origin, we can track how that's then come into the language, because we've got such great records these days.
Okay, so if we can do sort of backpedal a little bit, if we can do a little bit of history to be, what are some of the earliest examples of idioms, and where or when did they start catching on?
So you mean sort of more established idioms in English? So I mean, the one that's always used is kick the bucket, and I think this is one that still most speakers of English will use, or at least encounter. Kick the bucket is a euphemism for die, and this is 400, 500, 600 years old, something like that. So that's one that's been around in the language for a very long time. I mean, best guess is that people have always used figurative and metaphorical language, and the simple reason is that metaphor is really important for how we think and how we structure the world, and especially how we sort of think of abstract concepts. So I think a lot of people maybe think of metaphor as something quite literary, quite creative, probably because we encounter it at school. We're taught what metaphors and similes are, but we use metaphor all the time. And all it really means is you're talking about one thing in terms of another. So if I describe someone as a monster or as an animal or something like that, I'm using metaphor. I'm taking the properties of one thing, applying it to another. And all idioms really are is sort of very fixed ways of expressing a particular metaphorical idea. And given, you know, how much we use metaphor, these probably have been around as long as we've been using language. You know, we talk about things that aren't true or aren't literal in a, you know, an everyday way. So I don't think they're necessarily something that have kind of come or become more common over time. I think figurative language, as in going beyond the immediate, the literal, the concrete, has always been a really important part of how we communicate.
Okay, it's excuse me. It's quite there are an awful lot of expressions in there, idioms in there. So how long did it take you to write it?
It's been a few years, actually. It's been an ongoing project. It's a bit of a side hustle in the sense that it's not really what I do for my academic research. So you mentioned at the start, I'm a lecturer in psycholinguistics, and that's very much to do with language in the brain, how we learn languages, what the brain and the mind do to kind of make sense of language. So I study figurative language from that point of view. And what I tend to do in my working life is put together experiments to work out how we make sense of these things as well-known expressions, and how we make sense of metaphor and that kind of thing. And so I was more or less doing this on the side, and you know, kind of started paying attention to these phrases, these modern idioms, maybe 6 years ago. 5 or 6 years ago, and I've been sort of throwing ideas around since, and collecting a bit of a list and talking to friends about these and getting some ideas, and really just sort of writing it in the background. And I finished the book sort of late 2020. So it was sort of 3 or 4 years in the writing, and obviously now it's going to be coming out. It'll be really interesting to see what people make of it.
Yeah, who is the audience for it then, Gareth?
So it's kind of popular linguistics in the sense that it's not really academic. It's not aimed at academics or even language learners necessarily. It's sort of people who are hopefully interested in language, interested in how language develops, and just want to kind of know a bit more about where sort of phrases come from, how we use language. I've tried to put a little bit of, if you like, the kind of backstory in there. So the sort of the opening chapter is about, as you said at the start, sort of figurative language more broadly, metaphor, how we use it, why we use it, and then it gets into these examples. And I think the phrases in this book, lots of them people will know, but they won't necessarily know where they came from or how they evolved. Some, as with the example of jumping sharks, I think is one that will split people. You know, it's becoming more common. I do see it used, if you like, in the wild. In fact, I saw someone tweet it just this morning. Someone said Wordle has jumped the shark since it was bought by the New York Times, in the sense that it's become harder and people have been complaining a little bit. So, you know, someone used that phrase clearly expecting that their Twitter audience would know what it meant, but lots of people won't have done. So I think that there'll be sort of phrases that people will learn, and others that they'll maybe flesh out a bit. And the aim really is just to kind of, as you said, entertain as well as inform, really.
Yeah. Okay, you mentioned new ones coming in. Obviously, old ones die out. So, of those that you know that have died out, which would you be most sad about? What would you like to reintroduce?
It's a really, really good question, actually. So I think, again, if you have this conversation with people, there'll be idioms that I use. I'm 40, so I'm sort of not old, but not young, you know, so I'm sort of in the middle here. But I would know phrases like spend a penny, which is a phrase in English that my grandparents used. It means go to the toilet. But I could use that and ask a class of sort of 20-year-old students, and maybe 1 or 2 out of 30 or 40 would know it. And that suggests to me that it's very much on its way out.
Yeah.
One that's definitely gone, and I think most people would not know, is a great phrase, kick over the traces. Now, is that an idiom you would know at all?
No.
No, and this was a new one on me. It was used in an example by someone who gave a talk I saw a few years ago. And kick over the traces means to sort of be a bit wild and kind of do your own thing and be a bit rebellious, because it sort of refers to when horses used to draw carriages or things like that. The traces are the wooden poles or the chains that sort of hold the horse in place. So if you kick over the traces, you kind of go out of your restraints, if you like. But that's a phrase that I think has almost all but disappeared. I heard it used once in real life. There's a cricket commentator called Henry Blofeld, who's quite an old chap, very colourful language. And I heard him describe Ian Botham, very famous cricketer, as someone who used to kick over the traces, meaning he was quite rebellious. So I've heard one person use that phrase in 40 years in real life when we're not discussing it as people who are interested in phrases. So I think that's a phrase that's gone, but that is really quite colourful and quite evocative, and I think I'd love to sort of bring back, but I don't think people necessarily know what traces are, so you don't give them much chance of working it out, unfortunately.
Yeah, I guess you could use that with Eric Cantona as well, couldn't you?
Definitely, yeah. So exactly that sort of thing. It's sort of someone who does their own thing, doesn't really care about convention. That's exactly the usage. But again, it's the same principle as kick the bucket. So kick the bucket, people often sort of ask about the etymology, and the sort of guess is that it refers to people hanging themselves on an upturned bucket. But I mean, that sort of seems logical, but there's not really any evidence that that's true. The explanation I've heard is that bucket is an old dialect word for a wooden beam or a roof beam. So the logic is that you would, 500 years ago, when a lot of people kept their own animals, you would take an animal out to slaughter, you would tie it up to the bucket, and when you were sort of slitting its throat, it would spasm and it would kick against the bucket. Right. And that makes a lot of sense. But of course, we don't have that meaning of bucket anymore. So there's no way you could hear that phrase and with our modern use of the word ever get to that. In the same way, we don't know what traces are in that sense. So you can't hear that and you have no way of working it out. So phrases like that are sort of impenetrable because the language has changed and the phrases have stuck around, which is quite interesting. But because they kind of refer to what we might call a sort of iconic or symbolic thing, you know, kicking the bucket in that sense is one specific action of dying that then becomes very generalized. Same with kick over the traces, same with lots of other idioms. They refer to a sort of very specific action. The phrase becomes generalized, and a lot of people won't ever know that origin. They don't need to know the origin to understand the phrase necessarily.
Yeah, you mentioned the kick over the traces was a new one on you. So what's the strangest, apart from that one, what's the strangest that you've heard?
Oh, wow, that's an even better question. I mean, a lot of the best ones are from other languages, because a lot of the work I've done has then been looking at language learners and how language learners deal with English idioms, and then almost sort of flipping the script and asking people who speak other languages to then sort of try and understand idioms from their first language, but that we've translated it to English. So it's a bit of a sort of an artificial experiment, but it gives us some insight into how the languages interact. So there's some brilliant ones from Swedish. There's a lovely phrase, no cow on the ice. Any guesses as to what that means?
There's no milk in the fridge.
Not a million miles away. I mean, it could be. It's one of those idioms you could argue different ways. It actually means something like "there's no problems, there's nothing to worry about." So I assume, without knowing the backstory, that the logic is if you have a cow and it happens to wander onto a frozen lake, well, you should be pretty concerned. So if there's no cow on the ice, there's nothing to worry about. Another really great example that I've used in some of my experiments is one from Mandarin. Mandarin's got loads of idioms. They have these sort of half idiom, half proverb things that are very pervasive. And there's one that roughly translates as to draw a snake and add feet to it. And it means to sort of ruin something by being overly fussy and never quite sort of being satisfied. So you keep on adding extra detail. And it sort of alludes back to an old folk tale about someone who was in a drawing competition and they kept never quite happy with their drawing, so they ended up adding detail that ruined the picture. So phrases like that, I think, are brilliantly colourful. But, we could go through any number of idioms. Some of the ones in the book are fantastic. And one that was genuinely new to me, when I started sort of thinking about this, I had a class with some students and I asked them to bring in examples. And a student introduced me to Netflix and chill. Which is a phrase that I'd never heard before. So I had no reason to know that it's sort of quite euphemistic, and it's something that apparently younger people started saying to kind of allude to inviting someone over on the surface to come over and watch Netflix, but actually to perhaps get up to other activities that young people might get up to. So it was very, very euphemistic. And, when we think about the idioms that are, if you like, the topics that have lots of idioms, it tends to be things like death, sex, the kind of taboo things that we have a lot of euphemisms for. There are lists of idioms for those kinds of things.
Yeah, as a language teacher, an English language teacher, part of my sort of my background is in languages. I love hearing my students say things, when they catch on to things like it swings and roundabouts. I know that when I was in, I lived in China for a while, and I got them to translate "hold your horses," which is "ting ni de ma." And so when I used to get on the bus, I loved getting on the bus because you could see so much of the city when you were on the, instead of in a taxi, you know, you've got a leisurely drive into the city. When it came to my stop, I used to shout "ting ni de ma." Made no sense. They'd look at me, what? So, which are the favorite ones that you like hearing your students say, you know, your foreign students?
That's a good question. So I don't tend to teach English as a second language, so maybe I've not got as many good examples. But right. I think that the point of your story is absolutely right. When you try to translate these things, they just don't make sense. Some do. You know, this is kind of the thing. Some idioms are just basically metaphors. So something like "play with fire." No problem. It translates into lots of different languages. So same in French, jouer avec feu, for example. So that would be a fairly straightforward one. But one that's really interesting to hear is what the variants are for "to kill two birds with one stone," because that's quite a transparent idiom in the sense that it does what it sounds like it should. You know, it's I'm going to achieve two things with one action. But lots of different places have their own version of that. And you probably know the Chinese one better than me. I think it's something like "two hawks with one arrow." That tends to be the case in lots of languages. But there's various other ones like "two hares with one shot," two flies with one something or other. You know, so there's loads of variations of that. And I think just hearing those kind of things maybe gives us a little bit of an insight into different cultures. You know, those phrases are informed by things that are important in those cultures. Hunting, very often, for example, and then when you hear idioms from other cultures as well, you know, they tell us quite a lot. So German, for example, has got quite a few idioms that relate to sausages or pork farming or pork or pigs, because pig farming has been such an important part of German culture and history. So there's those sorts of things that are very interesting. But in terms of sort of students using idioms, you'll have seen this, I'm sure. It's so easy to get them ever so slightly wrong, and it's almost impossible to explain why. So I years ago had a friend who was Greek and who was teaching at university level in the UK. So his English was impeccable. He was able to teach physics in English, you know, so very, very high level of English. And he once used the phrase to me, "donkeys of years." And I think anyone who's got English as their first language would never say that. The phrase is "donkey's years," meaning a very long time. But it's almost impossible to explain why "donkeys of years" is wrong. It sounds like it should be right. It sounds grammatically slightly better formed, but it's that sort of slight mistake that, you know, you would never make as a native speaker, simply because you've heard that phrase your entire life. You've not had to learn it and almost try to work out the logic of it. You've almost gone the other way. So those kind of examples I think are really interesting, but they also flag up the importance of what's sort of broadly called these multi-word expressions or formulaic expressions. And again, as a language teacher, I'm sure you'll have taught things like collocation, so just the way that words go together. Because we tend to think of language as words and grammar. And if you learn the vocabulary and you learn the grammar, you can put it together. But it's so much more than that. The ways you put words together into phrases and into sort of units above the word is really conventional in some ways. It's really sort of arbitrary at times, and trying to learn this is very much about experience. It's just being about exposed to these patterns and sort of trying to assimilate them over time. I think is a huge challenge for any learner.
Yeah. Now we're getting sort of more aware of sort of not offending people. So are there some out there that could be construed as really offensive that we need to be careful about?
I mean, I think that's probably always going to be the case. There's plenty of phrases that include swear words or sort of rude words. I mean, again, I think the sort of more euphemistic ones, there's sort of more and less offensive ones. So one of the ones in the book, for example, "screw the pooch," which is quite an American phrase, but one that means, you know, make a complete mess of things. Based on the history that I've sort of found for that originally started life as a much ruder version of the same phrase. So replace the word "screw" with a much ruder word, and replace the word "pooch" with the word "dog," and you've got what apparently started life as a military phrase. And I think if you went around saying it, you'd be, you know, you'd offend one or two people. So of course we have to be careful, as you do with any sort of language choice. You know, there's the thing with idioms as well, I guess, is not just the words that are in them, but actually the tone or the sort of the nuance. So kick the bucket, again, being a good example. It means die, but it means die in quite a flippant way. You know, you wouldn't expect a doctor to turn around and say, I'm really sorry, you know, the patient's kicked the bucket, because it's completely inappropriate, because it's so flippant and it's so sort of throwaway. So there's all idioms, I think, have not just a sort of, if you like, a surface meaning, but they have a lot of contextual meaning that you have to get right in order to use them. And maybe that's where we run the risk of maybe offending people if you use them in slightly the wrong way. Yeah, I'm struggling to think of any out and out offensive ones, but maybe that's not a bad thing.
Yeah. All right. You mentioned TV earlier as well. Which TV show or maybe film, in your experience, is responsible for inspiring the most idioms?
Oh, well, I think that the TV one's a really interesting one, because there's certainly comedies. I think UK comedies, it's probably true of US, but I don't know the sort of TV as well. But in the UK, there's so many comedy shows that inspire catchphrases, that inspire sort of things that are part of the language. So one that, again, I'm sure a lot of viewers will know is Only Fools and Horses, which is a really famous comedy. And there's loads of phrases that are from that would be in sort of common usage. So things like lovely jubbly or you plonker, you know, these kind of phrases that were used in the show a lot. I don't know if you could call them idioms necessarily, because they don't really have their own meaning, but they're clearly references to something that you know most people would get, that are part of the vocabulary. I guess the interesting thing about the book is a lot of the examples come from maybe films or TV shows that you wouldn't necessarily know. So a good example of one that everyone knows is Groundhog Day. And to me, Groundhog Day has just basically become synonymous with deja vu. So we use it to mean something that's happened over and over again. But I had the very interesting experience of talking to students about this, and there was a student who knew the phrase but had never heard of the film. So I think that shows you that they kind of go beyond that original usage quite quickly. The flip side of that, something like know where the bodies are buried. You know, I think that's a phrase that's fairly common now. So if you're talking about someone who sort of got some dirty secrets, you know, or has knowledge of someone else's dirty secrets, probably more appropriately, you say they know where the bodies are buried, meaning, you know, if it came to it, they could tell you where all the really bad stuff was. And that originally comes from the film Citizen Kane, which is a really famous film, but I had no idea that that's where that phrase came from until I sort of started looking into these things. And it's a sort of fairly throwaway line in the original script that clearly, you know, has then sort of become more broadly used. Now, that's not to say that they invented it. It could be that was a phrase that perhaps had been used in Hollywood, or that was in sort of common spoken usage, but that's the sort of first usage that then seems to have kick-started it as a wider idiom. So those are sort of interesting examples, I think. But I think, yeah, so broadly speaking, TV shows are a really real goldmine, because they do inspire so many catchphrases, so many one-liners. Films, in the same way, you have very memorable quotations from films, and everyone knows things like, you know, "Run, Forrest, run," or you know, film lines that you would say, and almost you probably say in a sort of fairly sort of typical accent as well, to kind of reflect the way they were used in the film. And I don't think there's any way we couldn't say they are part of our vocabulary. They're certainly part of the cultural vocabulary of sort of British or American English speakers.
Yeah, it's kind of reminiscent a little bit, I guess, of Cockney rhyming slang, because I remember when I grew up, my mum always told me to use my loaf, or it's up the apples for you now, and you know, yeah, you mince pies, or your dolly pegs, or whatever. And I never realised what they were, or you know, let me have a butcher's at that, and I didn't realise it was rhyming slang, and so yeah, there's some kind of similarity there.
Absolutely, yeah. Cockney rhyming slang still alive and well. I think you know, lots of people would still use it, but you're right. It's very impenetrable if you don't know it, and you can't sort of. Some of them are fairly easy to work out, some not. But you know, it is its own sort of set version of figurative language, and there's some fantastic ones in there. My wife always uses the phrase skyrocket for pocket. For some reason, she just likes that phrase and always uses it. She's not from London. It's just one of those things. But I think things like that, as you say, you grew up with. So if you've grown up hearing those things, they're very commonplace. In the same way, lots of people who, well, whatever language you speak, you will grow up hearing phrases, you will grow up hearing idioms, so they'll be very natural to you. And it's perhaps only later in life, whether it's Cockney rhyming slang or whether it's sort of idioms or these fixed phrases, that you actually take a step back and say, hang on a minute, why does that mean that? That doesn't really make any sense. And I've had that experience, obviously, having looked closely at these things. But even before that, I remember being well into my 20s, if not 30s, before I stopped and thought, well, actually, no, I've no idea why that phrase means what it does. And you start to deconstruct it, and some you can and some you can't. But we almost don't question these things. We use them, and everyone sort of understands them, so they're just very useful. It's almost a kind of you either through necessity, because maybe you speak to someone who's a language learner and they say, why on earth do you say X? Or you're kind of getting into a conversation with someone where you're sort of talking about this topic, and you kind of talk about favorite phrases or whatever it might be, and you just start to dissect them. But it's an interesting thing that we don't ever really question that until there's a reason to question it, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. Are there any of these expressions that get your goat?
Get my goat, nice. I'm not sure there are, I mean, one that, not in the sense that I would sort of really despise and sort of hate to hear. I think they're all really interesting. One that I think's an interesting one, doesn't really get my goat, but it kind of, I find sort of a bit irksome, is raining cats and dogs, purely because I think it's one that language teachers very often teach people. So it's often in textbooks, it's often held up as this example of an English idiom, and no one ever uses it. I don't think I've ever heard anyone genuinely say it's raining cats and dogs in my life. I would never say it. So I think it's almost that's a bit of a misleading one, in the sense that it's not quite as common as people are led to believe, but it would always appear on these sort of lists of common English idioms. And actually, only a couple of weeks ago, there was quite an interesting piece in some of the newspapers in the UK, sort of talking about idioms that were on their way out. And they did a bit of a survey of about 2,000 people of various ages. And they found only about 50% of people would still understand the phrase raining cats and dogs. Now, I find that a bit hard to believe, given that the raining bit sort of gives it away. It's not hard to work out the rest of it. But I guess if the point is only 50% of people would have heard it, then maybe our intuitions that it's a really common idiom are wrong. So maybe that's a good reason to say, look, we'll start sidelining that one a little bit. Having said that, I can't think of a better example in English as to how we would describe it raining heavily. So maybe it's place after all.
I have heard it used, but only by foreign students.
There you go. Yeah.
Who've been taught it before. I have to say though, some of the teaching idioms or rhyming slang, they're great classes. They're a lot of fun. They're a lot of fun to have.
I can believe it. Yeah. Sorry.
No. Yeah, it is. It's a lot of fun. Students tend to have a lot of fun with them as well. They love the rhyming slang. Don't always understand it, but they do get it. Yeah, it's good.
I remember I learned French to sort of A level and slightly beyond, and I remember doing exactly that, sort of having a lesson in French of French idioms, and again, it's almost makes you pay more attention to English ones. But it was great, you learn all these sort of interesting phrases. So I think in French, instead of saying, we would say when pigs fly in English, meaning something that will never happen. The French would say when chickens have teeth. So it's things like that. I don't think they tell you anything groundbreaking about the kind of cultural history, but it's just interesting the sort of expressions we've chosen to express the same ideas, really. So it's always interesting, and I think talking again to students from different backgrounds, different language backgrounds, about how they would express these ideas is great fun as well.
Yeah, I think as well, because they're so visual, they conjure up a lot of imagery. They tend to be remembered a lot easier.
Definitely, and actually, it's there's been academic research to suggest that that's absolutely the case. So there was a PhD that I read a couple of years ago, and the guy who'd written it did exactly that. He sort of tested how well people remember idioms when you present them with these sort of images that really kind of play on the figurative elements versus things that just give you the literal or just explanations, and people remember them, people understand them and remember them much better if you're really kind of getting them to think about the imagery and the elements that contribute to it. Obviously that's much easier for some than others, but it's very much about getting people, I think, to understand the meaning, and as I say, kind of the contextual meaning, how you can use them, not just what they mean. And if you can do that, then I think people can start to try and deploy them in everyday conversation. Then you've got a much better chance of remembering them and starting to have that kind of more, maybe slightly more authentic experience, or slightly more native like use of the language, if that's what you're aiming for.
Okay. The first person I heard say "squeaky bum time" was Alex Ferguson, which is one of my. I mean, I'm a United fan anyway, so that's probably one of my favourites. Squeaky bum time. I really like it, and I've heard it used quite a bit since then. And I noticed in your book as well, it's in there. So, which would be your favourite, or which one would you use most?
Well, we'll stick with squeaky bum time because I think it's a great one. So you're absolutely right. So Sir Alex Ferguson, one of the greatest football managers that there's ever been in the country, in certainly in English football. But I'm absolutely with you. As far as I'm aware, he was the first person to use squeaky bum time, meaning a very sort of tense situation. I think there's more and less rude interpretations of the phrase personally, but we'll maybe leave that one there. But there's other phrases that he's introduced to us. So the hairdryer treatment is another one that football fans will know, meaning sort of shouting at someone in a very forceful way. That's one of his. Even football fans will know Fergie time. The idea that Manchester United very often were seen as getting kind of extra time added on at the end of the game, and it wasn't really true. It was a bit of a myth, but it was sort of, again, it all entered the language. I think they're all really lovely ones. One of my favourites, one of the perhaps slightly ruder ones, is "No S, Sherlock," and I'll let you fill in the S for yourself. And it's just a really nice phrase. I think it's one that I've sort of heard increasingly over the years, and it's not got a particularly interesting story behind it, other than the fact it's sort of started to be used for very obvious things. It's in the book, and there's some nice examples in there of. I think there's a Reddit page or a Reddit sort of thread about things that make you say, "No S, Sherlock," and just some great examples of stupidly self-evident and obvious headlines. So things like that I think are really interesting. Yeah, any others? I think "jump the shark's" a great one. I think it's a really nice phrase, simply because it's to me, it's kind of the archetypical modern idiom. If "kick the bucket" is our kind of classic example, then to me "jump the shark" is the modern version of that. Simply because if you've never heard it, then good luck working out what it means. But I think it's really, when you know what it means, it's a really useful, really kind of evocative phrase. So that would be up there, I think, certainly for me.
Yeah, it really is. All right, we're almost done now, Gareth. It is a fantastic book. I've had a brief look through it, but I can't, because I'm doing a little bit of research myself as well. So I had to sort of go in between. I'd have a rest here and there. But there's some fantastic expressions in there. Where would our subscribers be able to buy the book from?
So first thing, I guess, is to show you what it looks like. So this is the book, Jumping Sharks and Dropping Mics, and you can get it from most booksellers. So it's on Amazon. You can get it through Waterstones, WH Smiths in the UK. Any other online booksellers, you should be able to get it in paperback form or in ebook form, and it is released on the 25th of February. You can pre-order it if you would like. That would be great. If not, it's out very soon, so you can get hold of a copy.
That's fantastic. Gareth, once again, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you and learning from you.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me.
All right. It's a pleasure. Bye-bye now. Take care.
Yes. Bye-bye.